Hey, it's Paula Finch. So this video is going to be me reading my paper that I got a 95 on that I mentioned. It's kind of long. It's like 8-ish pages plus citations, which is like 9 pages. So this might be 2 videos, but if it is 2 videos, I'll upload them one right after the other, just so it's, more flowy. Air's going on, like the AC, so sorry if you hear that. But it's a bit hot and like muggy where I am. So it's quieting now. Let's start. So, interpreting Eurydice myths using literary elements. Within the original myth of Eurydice, the main focus was about how her husband Orpheus had gone to the land of the dead to plead for her life back. He was given the chance to bring her back to life with the condition of him not being allowed to look back at her as they traveled to the surface. He almost succeeded. However, as the entrance to the surface approached, he looked back, causing Eurydice's second death. This version came from Ovid, who was alive from 43 BCE to 17 CE. This is only one interpretation of the myth. There are many others that vary slightly to drastically from this one. The version that differs significantly is The Other Eurydice, found in Numbers in the Dark by Italo Calvino, where this interpretation was more focused on Pluto trying to accommodate Eurydice and get her comfortable with being underground, meaning being dead. However, despite his best efforts, Eurydice is abducted by Orpheus. Being written sometime between 1943 and 1984, this is a more modern interpretation of the myth. The different perspectives of whose side we're seeing can bring insight into the culture during the periods of when the myth was being written. By looking deeper into the themes, the other elements presented, we can analyze and distinguish cultural values and infer why those values may have been important during the time. Within each version of the myth, there are multiple themes that provide insight on the culture during that time period. Ovid's version contains themes such as love, failure, as well as loyalty. Calvino's shares similar themes of failure, but also contains unique themes of freedom as well as the idea of opposites. Loyalty and love are the basis of Ovid's version. It was because Orpheus loved Eurydice that he risked everything to try and give her a second chance at life. The loyalty aspect coincides with the theme of love. He was loyal to her even after death. They were newlyweds, and although we don't know how long they were together before marrying, not many people would declare, quote, I'm determined not to return. You can delight in both our deaths, unquote. Parentheses, Ovid, Orpheus, and Eurydice, paragraph 3. To anyone they weren't loyal to. He was essentially saying that if Pluto, the lord of the underworld, refused to grant a second chance at life to his wife, he would rather remain where the dead belonged than go back to the living without her. The theme of failure is present in both tellings of the myth. However, the failure within each differs. Within Ovid's version, the failure comes from Orpheus being unable to return with his wife due to his own actions. Drawing near to the threshold of the upper world, afraid she is no longer there and eager to see her, the lover turned his eyes. In an instant, she dropped back, unquote. Sorry. Ovid, Orpheus and Eurydice, paragraph 6. Contrastingly, Calvino's was the failure of not being able to stop Eurydice from being taken. Quote, I made one more move forward to the point where, for a moment, I had seen Eurydice, but she was gone, and gone likewise her abductor. Unquote. Calvino 225. In this version, the outlook is a bit different. Pluto is trying to travel to the center of the earth with Eurydice, essentially keeping her far from the surface where she's tempted to break the boundary of the living and dead. But similarly to Ovid's, the protagonist fails at what they wanted to accomplish. Akin to how Ovid's themes tied into each other, the themes of freedom and opposites also relate to one another. Freedom for Eurydice is being able to reach the surface. She tries her best by spending her free time in volcanoes, which are technically above the surface of the earth, but not above ground. Pluto has opposite views. Above ground to him is chaotic, where he has no control and thus no freedom. Sound has a large part to play with this. Underground, all sounds are vibrations, while above ground they are what we are accustomed to. Pluto views them as sharp and shrill. Another difference between the two is where they view. Uh, Another difference between the two are where they each view where she belongs. Pluto thinks her rightful place is underground, as she is dead and the dead should not walk among the living. Quote, terrestrial life was our goal, the life of the earth and in the earth, not what sprouts on the surface. End quote. Calvino 22. Within e- within the uh, sorry, within the earth representing the dead and the surface representing life. She views herself as still living, or at least curious of the living. Quote, following Eurydice on one of her wandering whims, we entered the throat of the volcano. End quote. Calvino 222. In both myths, the theme of failure is evident. Ovid's version had Orpheus fail at what he set out to do, and in Calvino's, Pluto failed to prevent Eurydice from leaving. In a way, it's kind of ironic how in each of their it's kind of ironic how in their own myths they failed, but in what oh my gosh. In a way, it's kind of ironic how in their own myth they failed, but in the other they succeeded in a way. Within Ovid, Pluto got to keep Eurydice as she died a second time, and in Calvinus, Orpheus successfully escaped with Eurydice. Perspective can help with understanding as well, specifically about the time period. Some methods of writing are popular during certain periods. With Ovid, it's popular to have the stories be told in third person with occasional first person dialogue. Quote, I beg of you, by these fearful places, by this immense abyss, and the silence of your vast realms, reverse Eurydice's swift death. End quote. Ovid, Orpheus, and Eurydice, paragraph 3. The reason for this is probably because before these myths were written down, they were told to audiences orally, and thus you would tell them from a third-person perspective. The poet who was presented would probably switch to first person when trying to do dialogue. From the quote, you could tell it's spoken in an almost poetic way. It probably rhymed in its original language, but due to translation it lost its fluidity, and even maybe some meaning behind the words spoken by Orpheus, as well as translation, meaning could have been lost due to the significant difference in culture, as in words and actions might have been seen as more significant during Ovid's time, whereas in the present we write it off as nothing noteworthy. Comparatively, the other Eurydice, although translated, was written more modernly compared to Ovid, meaning that the meanings of mannerisms and actions shown in the myth are more closely aligned to what we know of. Another difference is perspective. This myth is told from a first-person perspective, specifically Pluto's, and the way it's written almost sounds like a soliloquy in a play, with how it looks back on the past actions and thoughts to progress the narrative forward. Quote, why did Eurydice fall into the trap? She belonged entirely to our world. End quote. Calvino 221. By asking this, we know that something happened to Eurydice, moving the plot forward, but the word did shows that the action had already taken place and he's reminiscing. The different writing styles indicate the time period. Ovid is more traditional to his era, where the myths are told from third-person perspective, with the hero being obvious as well as being noble. Calvino's was written more modernly, where the boundary between whether the protagonist is good is blurred, allowing for more interpretations. We don't know whether Pluto was in the wrong or not. When we compare it to Ovid's, it could be interpreted as Pluto being in the wrong for keeping Eurydice when she blatantly was vying to get out. Sorry for the sirens. But as a standalone, we see Orpheus as the bad one because he lured Eurydice away with his music. So context and perspective is important to think about when reading myths, because if you compare it to another version, you're more likely to be biased for or against a character depending on how the other version makes the character out to be. But if you look at it in the perspective of the retelling being a reference, you can see the plot and characters in a new light and depth. This can only be achieved due to the creative liberties that came with writing culture that evolved through time. The time period a myth is written can alter one's interpretation, especially when you apply these events happening when it was written to the myth. During Ovid's time, they were just starting to think about how things were viewed as scientifically. Quote, science was considered a part of philosophy. Today we view science as factual and consider philosophy subjective, but in ancient times philosophy was considered objective. End quote. Theory in Divinity 46. By learning more about the time period and how people were learning It could be interpreted that the Eurydice and Orpheus myth was their own way of trying to explain death. The Greeks used myths as a way to explain things, hence why they were gods in charge of elements and natural phenomena. Romans, being influenced by Greeks' way of telling myths as an explanation, as well as starting to integrate more scientific concepts to myths, might make a myth to explore why once you're dead you can't come back to life, and thus came up with the Orpheus and Eurydice myth. Through advancements in technology and science, we now know that the reason for permanent death isn't because people look back when approaching the surface from the land of the dead. Instead, it's about your body's access to oxygen. If your brain doesn't receive oxygen from your blood, then it makes your body unable to function, meaning your heart stops circulating your blood, and it becomes a positive feedback loop of your body shutting down until you're dead, leading to permanent death. I'm gonna stop that there because I have about 3 more pages left. So this is part 1. Thank you for listening. I'll be right back. See ya.